Today I'm going to present to you an argument that may affect you personally. The Great Barrier Reef suffering negative impacts from human aggression due to tourism activities by Christy Lee Denham. This presentation argues the health of the Great Barrier Reef versus the boost in the Australian economy by highlighting the negative impacts on the Great Barrier Reef and marine life due to tourism activities. Tourism on the Great Barrier Reef has increased significantly and therefore boosting the Australian economy and the growth of communities along the Queensland coast. Tourism is important for the survival of Queensland coastal communities, but human degradation is having a negative impact, resulting in significant damage on the Great Barrier Reef and its marine life. This presentation argues the boom in tourism economy versus the health of the Great Barrier Reef by discussing the negative impacts from tourism activities. This presentation discusses three significant arguments and reviews the course of action tourism operators are undertaking to improve and reduce the damage and reviews the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority zoning plans to ensure preservation of the reef and continued benefits to tourism and economic development. Research has found anthropogenic activities from the tourism industry are having a negative impact on the Great Barrier Reef. This view has been formed by numerous scientific studies but also subject to controversy, with counter studies indicating economic development has increased in a greater understanding of the Great Barrier Reef. Firstly, I will argue the economic significance of tourism activities against the health of the Great Barrier Reef. In achieving this, I will highlight the negative impacts of economic growth and associated tourism activities and direct and indirect damage to the reef. Secondly, the increased degradation of fish and wildlife stocks from recreational fishing practices, in particular the shark population, which is facing increasing strain from increased fishery impacts on dugong and turtle populations, resulting in an endangered listing. And thirdly, commercial shipping interest from increasing use of the Great Barrier Reef marine waters from cruise liners and other large-scale marine tourist transportation. Before I discuss the arguments surrounding the Great Barrier Reef, I will begin by discussing the overall threats posed on the Great Barrier Reef from tourism activities. A technical report developed by the CRC Reef Research Centre outlines many considerations and threats posed to the Great Barrier Reef by tourism activities. It specifies factors such as coastal and marine infrastructure, boating and water-based activities as potential threats to the reef environment. The growth in communities along the Great Barrier Reef and associated tourism-based activities lends to the argument for human-based degradation of the reef. The Australian Government concurs with that outlined by Harriet in that tourism may also have a negative impact with fragile corals broken by reef walking, dropped anchors, or by boats dropping fuel and other sorts of pollution. Even the number of people on the water with the associated runoff of sweat and suntan lotions may well have a negative impact on the fragile reef environment. Obviously, as pollution grows and development fuels tourism along the Great Barrier Reef, there will be continued and mounting pressure on the reef and its environment by human activities. This is not very reassuring for concerned Australians like us. So recapping on tourism activities impacting the Great Barrier Reef are coastal and marine infrastructure, water-based activities such as boating, reef walking, sweat and suntan lotions. My first argument discusses the harmful effects of tourism activities on the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and its inhabitants. The construction and development of coastal communities places increased pressure on services such as sewage, refuse, transport, electricity, as well as on catchment water quality. Increases in economic development and tourism subsequently increase the pressure on these systems. Sadly, the impact from waste, refuse, has global implications. It is estimated that more than 100 million marine animals are killed each year due to plastic debris in the ocean. More than 80% of this plastic comes from land. It washes out from our beaches and streets. It travels through storm drains into streams and rivers. It flies away from landfills into our seas As a result, thousands of sea turtles accidentally swallow this plastic, mistaking them for food. Fortunately, experts are calling for increased efforts to protect dugongs and sea turtles from death due to tourism activity. With reports, recreational boating and fishing practices have seen a record number of sea turtle deaths along the coast. Similar incidents with turtle fertility by boating are noted in the United States Virgin Islands. So, as you can see, a clear, concerted effort is required to minimise refuse, entry to the reef environment, and manage boating activity. Otherwise, there would be continued decimation of sea turtle populations. My second argument is the real impact from recreational and commercial operators fishing on the Great Barrier Reef. Taylor from the CSIRO published that recreational fishing removes a large number of sharks from the reef, and research suggests that the outlook for several species is not good. Also, in 2012, Fisheries Queensland conducted a diary and telephone survey and estimated the recreational catch of sharks to be higher than the state's commercial catch. The real impact of recreational fishing on shark populations is not quantifiable. Given no specific data is recorded when compared to commercial fishing, and in contrast to Taylor, Fernanda states that even though recreational fishing may be seen as a negative, the majority of the sharks are released and impact may be less than first thought. Therefore, as you can see, impacts from recreational fishing on the reef are highly speculative and less measurable than commercial fishing. However, this lends to my argument that given the potential for negative and damaging impacts, further monitoring is needed to quantify the impact. My third argument is the shipping and associated activities that pose a high risk to the Great Barrier Reef. Cruise shipping has been a large contributor to tourism in the Great Barrier Reef, but brings associated waste, pollution, and mooring issues. Past events highlight the danger posed by vessel movement in and around the reef. You may remember in April 2010, a ship named the Shen-Nen-1 ran aground on the Douglas Shore Reef system, killing a 3-kilometre long, 400,000 square metre scar on the Great Barrier Reef. Of this, an estimated 150,000 square metres of the shoal was severely damaged or completely destroyed, while the remaining area suffered patchy or moderate damage. As you may be aware, cruise ships are also often flush an enormous amount of sewage and food waste and oily bilge water as a suspension of insoluble particles in the ocean. In 2008, an EPA report on cruise ship pollution discharged stated that decaying waste and ocean dumping increases water acidity and significantly decreases the oxygen level. This results in increase of toxic algae blooms, which is a major threat to coral reefs. It is obvious that marine inhabitants and the reef is experiencing acute threat from marine vessels. These movement and access of vessels must be monitored and enforced to mitigate impacts. However, reassuringly, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority recognises the adverse challenges facing the reef by tourism, but the challenge lies in keeping an adequate balance between the reef and social and economic needs. Sustainable tourism state, visitor demand has increasingly focused on the provision of tourism experiences. Therefore, education is paramount in ensuring the sustainability of the reef asset. Kontiki is a multinational company specialising in tourism and promotes an ethos which strives to ensure environmental protection by guests. Katrina Barry, Managing Director of Kontiki, cited in Williams in 2014 stated, Our guests and the Contiki team have an insatiable appetite for discovering the world, and with that comes a responsibility to respect and protect the places we travel to for future generations. Damage to the Great Barrier Reef is an important issue facing us, and further to the need for education is the need for regulation and management to mitigate impacts. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has developed a policy to protect the Great Barrier Reef by implementing zoning plans. Zoning provides protection for areas critical to maintaining a healthy environment and sets a broad framework for the management of human use by designating where specific types of activities can take place. The management and implementation of such regulation policies is challenged by the scale of the reef and continued breaches of regulated zones. For example, the Observer reported commercial vessel activity within the exclusion zones. This highlights the challenges facing management of activities and their impact on the Great Barrier Reef, particularly given the reef shear scale. Even though it is clear that government bodies are working together to enforce red tape, drastic changes need to take place to save this iconic marine park from dying for future generations to come. In this diagram, you can see the zones. So for example, Zone 1 is the Cape York zone, and Zone 12 is Mackay, etc. It is now time to draw this presentation to a conclusion. And in summary, as you can see, anthropogenic activities from the tourism industry are having a negative impact on the Great Barrier Reef. And although tourism boosts the Australian economy, it has a negative impact on the health of the Great Barrier Reef. Management of the reef and its environs is challenging given the scale of the reef area. Today I argued the effects of tourism activities and the detrimental effects it is having on the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and plans in place to protect the Great Barrier Reef and its necessary means to preserve and protect the Great Barrier Reef. I also argued the effects of tourism is having on the Great Barrier Reef by outlining the problematic issues causing a negative impact on marine life from recreational fishing, boating and cruise shipping. So as you can see, preservation of the reef and continued benefits of tourism and economic development hinges on the correct education and management of and adherence by all stakeholders. Although tourism, education and awareness along with red tape may improve future survival of the reef, it also requires continued enforcement and management to ensure the health of the Great Barrier Reef is sustained. With the increase in popularity of the Great Barrier Reef as a tourist destination and the ever-changing political climate and commitment to its safety, one can only hope the governments of tomorrow see through this important issue to ensure the better health of the Great Barrier Reef.